Far across the sands, great pyramids rose, stone upon stone, heavy lifted by many hands, placed carefully, one above another, until the shape was complete. Inside, narrow tunnels, silent passageways, led to hidden chambers. Pharaohs were buried here, with treasures, food, amulets, everything they would need in the afterlife. Temples stood tall, columns carved with stories. Priests lit incense, the air filled with smoke. Gods carved in stone watched in silence. The desert wind blew softly across monuments that have stood for thousands of years. The people believed in many gods. Ra, the sun god, crossing the sky each day. Osiris, ruler of the underworld. Isis, the mother goddess, caring for her people. Horus, the falcon-headed god, watching from above. At night, the stars shone brightly. People wondered what waited after death. They believed the heart of each person would be weighed against a feather. If light, the soul lived forever. If heavy, it was lost. So they lived with faith, with ritual, with devotion. Egypt was ruled by pharaohs. They were both kings and gods. There was Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid. There was Akhenaten, who worshipped only the sun. There was Nefertiti, known for her beauty. There was Tutankhamun, the boy king, whose tomb was filled with gold. And there was Cleopatra, the last queen, who spoke many languages and ruled with strength. Statues of rulers stood tall, carved in stone, unmoving, eternal. Most people were farmers. Some made pottery, some made jewelry, some were scribes. Scribes dipped reed pens in ink and wrote carefully on papyrus. Soldiers guarded the land and marched along the borders. Meals were simple: bread, beer, onions, dates, fish. Families gathered together, told stories, and rested under the evening sky. The desert cooled, the stars shone bright, and the night was calm. Egyptians studied medicine. They used herbs, honey, and oils to heal. They set broken bones, stitched wounds, read the pulse. They studied the sky. They watched the stars, the sun, the moon. They created a calendar, followed the seasons, predicted the floods of the Nile. Knowledge was written on papyrus, guarded in temples, passed from teacher to student. Calmly, patiently, across the centuries. Writing was sacred. Hieroglyphs, pictures carved into stone. After the desert, the mountains rose slowly on the horizon. Their peaks were covered in mist, their slopes stretching endlessly upward. The caravan approached carefully. Each step was slower now, each path narrower. But still, the journey continued calm and steady. The air grew cooler as the caravan climbed. The wind moved gently between the rocks. Birds circled high above, their wings wide against the gray sky. Travelers wrapped their cloaks tighter. The camels walked patiently, their hooves steady on the stony ground. The mountains did not rush. They had been there for ages, silent and unmoving. Snow lay hidden on the highest peaks, melting only drop by drop, forming streams that trickled down into valleys. The sound of water was soft, almost like a whisper. Travelers followed it, step after step. Sometimes the path wound along a cliff, where the drop below was deep and endless. The caravan moved carefully, one by one, the bells of the camels ringing softly in the silence. No one spoke. There was no need. The sound of footsteps and wind was enough. In the valleys, villages appeared, small and quiet. Houses built of stone and wood, smoke rising slowly from their roofs. Farmers tilled narrow fields, their plows pulled by oxen. Children watched the travelers pass, their faces curious, but their voices quiet. Here, merchants paused. They rested in wooden inns, warmed by fires that burned low in the hearth. Tea was poured into clay cups, steaming gently. The taste was simple, the warmth comforting after the cold mountain air. Conversations were soft, words spoken in many languages. Some traders stayed for days, waiting for weather to clear, for snow to melt, for storms to pass. At night, the mountains were still. Stars filled the sky above the peaks, their light faint and steady. The world seemed endless, but also close, as if the mountains themselves were listening. Travelers lay on mats, wrapped in thick blankets, their bodies weary, their minds drifting. Beyond the deserts and mountains, the Silk Road opened into towns. These towns were not loud, not rushed, but steady, patient, and calm. They grew slowly, where caravans stopped, where travelers needed rest, where merchants exchanged goods. The gates of a town rose out of the dust, tall and weathered by centuries. Caravans entered slowly, their bells ringing softly as they passed through. Inside, the streets were narrow, lined with stalls and workshops. The smell of spices drifted through the air, cinnamon, pepper, saffron, each carried from distant lands. Merchants spread their goods on low tables. Rolls of silk shimmered in the light. Pottery gleamed in careful rows. Metal tools clinked softly as they were arranged. There was no shouting. Voices here were calm, measured, steady. Buyers leaned close, speaking slowly, weighing coins in their hands. Children ran between the stalls, their laughter faint. Dogs lay sleeping in the shade. The hum of the market was constant, but never hurried. A buyer might spend an hour looking at a single roll of cloth, touching it, folding it, unfolding it again. There was time for patience. There was no need for haste. Caravans stopped here for days, sometimes weeks. Animals rested in stables. Loads were unpacked and repacked. Stories were exchanged in many languages: Chinese, Persian, Arabic, Greek. Some words were understood, some were not. But the rhythm of conversation was soft and unbroken. At night, the markets grew quiet. Stalls closed, shutters lowered. Lamps glowed behind wooden doors. In courtyards, families sat together, eating bread, rice, and stew. The voices of the day faded into whispers, then into silence. The town slept, as the road itself slept, under the steady watch of the stars. Not all towns were the same. Some were small, with only a few houses and a single inn. Others grew large, with wide streets and tall walls. But all of them shared the same rhythm, the rhythm of travelers passing through, the rhythm of slow trade, the rhythm of history moving step by step. Scribes sat in corners, writing records of goods bought and sold. Priests lit incense in temples, their prayers drifting upward like smoke. Guards stood at the gates, their spears resting against their shoulders, their eyes watching calmly. Life was steady. Life was quiet. For the merchants, the towns were more than markets. They were pauses, places to breathe, places to rest. The road was long, but these towns broke the journey into slower steps. Here one could sleep in a bed, drink water from a well, feel the shade of a tree. Simple things, but precious after days in the desert, after weeks in the mountains. And so, the towns became part of the Silk Road itself. Not just points along the journey, but threads in the fabric of history. Each one added its own quiet rhythm, its own soft voice to the endless story. When the caravan left, the towns remained. The stalls opened again, the gates stood tall, the markets hummed quietly. New travelers would come, new goods would arrive, but the rhythm stayed the same. Slow, calm, patient. The Silk Road was not just a path between lands. It was a chain of lives linked by markets and inns, by wells and gates, by trade and silence. And each link was steady. Each link was patient. Each link was timeless. The Silk Road was not only a path of sand and stone. It was also a road of water, slow-moving across rivers and seas. Where the caravans ended, the ships began. At the edges of the land, ports waited. Quiet harbors where the waves touched the shore, where sails swayed gently in the breeze. Merchants arrived with their camels, their loads carried carefully through narrow streets. Bales of silk, jars of spices, carved ivory, and porcelain bowls were lifted one by one, placed onto waiting ships. There was no rush. Each crate was tied, each jar wrapped, each bundle stored. The work was patient, measured, careful. The ports were never silent, but they were never hurried. Fishermen mended their nets in the shade. Sailors carried ropes over their shoulders. Children sat on the docks, watching the ships with wide eyes. Voices rose and fell, not in shouts, but in steady tones. The sea itself was the loudest sound, waves breaking softly, endlessly against the wooden hulls. When the tide came in, the ships departed. Their sails opened slowly, catching the wind. The ropes creaked. The decks groaned. The ships moved forward, not quickly, but steadily, gliding across the water. The land grew smaller, and the horizon stretched wide. Days at sea were long but calm. The waves rolled endlessly. The wind shifted gently. Sailors walked across the deck, their steps heavy, their voices low. Some repaired sails, some polished wood, some sat quietly, staring into the water, lost in thought. The journey was slow, measured by the rising and setting of the sun, by the phases of the moon, by the endless passing of the stars. At night, the sea was dark and vast. Stars reflected on the water, broken by ripples, scattered like fragments of glass. Sailors lay on the deck, their eyes fixed on the sky. The constellations guided them, pointing the way forward. No clocks, no maps, only the steady rhythm of the heavens. The ports at the other end were waiting. Distant cities with towers and harbors, markets and temples. Goods were unloaded, slowly, carefully carried into warehouses. Merchants counted coins, recorded trades, nodded to one another in calm agreement. Ships rested, their sails tied, their ropes coiled. Sometimes storms came. The sea grew loud, the wind fierce. Waves rose high, tossing the ships like leaves. But even storms passed. The sea returned to calm. The journey resumed. The rhythm continued. For centuries, these sea routes carried silk, spices, gems, and stories from one land to another. From China to India, from India to Arabia, from Arabia to the distant ports of Europe. Slowly, endlessly, without haste. The Silk Road was not only a path of earth. It was also a path of water. A quiet, patient road of ships and harbors, waves and winds, sailors and stars. A road that moved with the same calm rhythm as the deserts, as the mountains, as the markets. And so, the ports became part of the story. Their docks weathered by centuries, their stones smoothed by countless footsteps, their waters filled with the reflections of sails. The sea itself became a silent road, carrying history forward, one slow journey at a time. The Silk Road was not only traveled by merchants. It was also walked by monks, scholars, and wanderers. Many of them carried nothing to sell. Instead, they carried words, stories, and quiet thoughts written slowly into journals. The pages were filled not with excitement, but with patience. A monk might write, "The road stretched long today. The sky was clear. The mountains far ahead were covered with snow." Simple words, steady words. Day after day, line after line, the records continued. One traveler spoke of the silence of the desert. He wrote about the way the wind shifted the dunes, about how the sand covered footprints within hours, erasing all signs of the caravan. Another traveler described the slow climb up a mountain pass, where snow fell lightly and where footsteps crunched with every step. Nothing was hurried. The words were written slowly, the ink drying carefully on the page. Travelers did not rush their stories, just as they did not rush their journeys. In temples along the way, monks copied scrolls by hand. Each brushstroke was calm, measured, deliberate. The characters filled the page one by one, each shaped with patience. To read such scrolls was to feel the slowness of time itself. Some travelers recorded the markets they saw. They described stalls filled with spices, cinnamon, pepper, saffron, lined neatly in jars. They described silk cloth folded in careful layers, shimmering in the sunlight. They described coins exchanged, hands shaking gently in agreement, and the steady murmur of languages blending together. Others wrote not about trade, but about people. They wrote of the faces they saw in distant towns, farmers carrying baskets, children playing in narrow streets, old men sitting quietly in courtyards, women drawing water from wells. They wrote of greetings shared with strangers, of bread offered around a fire, of stories whispered under the stars. Centuries passed. Egypt was invaded by Persians, by Greeks, by Romans. The old kingdom faded. Temples crumbled. Pyramids weathered in the sand. Yet Egypt lived on. In stories, in monuments, in memory. Even today, the Nile still flows. The pyramids still rise. And the desert wind still whispers softly across the land. Now our journey is ending. You may let go of the words, let go of the thoughts. Drift deeper and deeper into rest. The sands are quiet now. The river is calm, and you may sleep. The river was everything. It gave water, it gave soil, it gave food, and the people knew that without the river there was nothing. They watched carefully each year when the floods came, the water rising, spreading across the land, and then slowly falling, leaving behind rich black soil. In that soil seeds were planted, crops grew tall, and harvests filled the baskets. Families stored grain, baked bread, brewed beer from barley, and lived simply on the gifts of the river. The men guided oxen pulling wooden plows. The women ground grain between stones. Children helped gather vegetables, and the elders sat in the shade. The river was everything. It gave water, it gave soil, it gave food, and the people knew that without the river there was nothing. They watched carefully each year when the floods came, the water rising, spreading across the land, and then slowly falling, leaving behind rich black soil. In that soil seeds were planted, crops grew tall, and harvests filled the baskets. Families stored grain, baked bread, brewed beer from barley, and lived simply on the gifts of the river. The men guided oxen pulling wooden plows. The women ground grain between stones. Children helped gather vegetables, and the elders sat in the shade, watching, remembering, telling the same stories to the next generation. The rhythm of work never changed. It was always the same, morning to night, season to season, year to year. At night the village was quiet. The stars shone brightly in the sky, and the sound of insects filled the silence. Families sat outside their homes, sharing bread, drinking beer, telling stories. Some spoke of the river, some of the gods, some of ancestors long gone, but all voices were calm, all voices slow, because in the desert night there was no hurry. A clay lamp burned softly, casting a weak glow. Children grew sleepy. Elders spoke less and less, and soon the village was silent, only the stars above and the cool air around. Sleep came easily in such a place, where every day was the same as the last, where tomorrow would bring the same work, the same river, the same life. The people believed in many gods, but belief was not excitement. It was routine, it was duty. A man placed bread before a small shrine. A woman poured beer as an offering. A child repeated the words taught by elders, not thinking, only following. The gods were part of life, as regular as sunrise, as certain as the flood. Ra crossed the sky each day. Osiris waited in the underworld. Isis cared for the family. Horus watched from above. The rituals were repeated, always the same words, always the same gestures, a pattern that stretched for centuries. The sound of priests chanting was low, slow, heavy with incense, heavy with silence. The people did not question, they followed, because to follow was easier than to think, to repeat was safer than to change. Work continued each day. Some men carved stone, shaping blocks, dragging them across sand, stacking them one upon another. The sound of stone on stone echoed in the desert, slow, heavy, endless. Others painted walls, symbols upon symbols, repeating lines, repeating shapes, until the walls were filled, but still the work continued. Some men sat as scribes, dipping reed pens into ink, writing slowly, carefully, always the same signs, always the same records. They wrote of harvests, of taxes, of offerings, of births and deaths. Each word recorded, each line preserved, but always the same, always routine, never changing. To write was to repeat was to exist. Egypt was ruled by pharaohs. They were both kings and gods. There was Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid. There was Akhenaten, who worshipped only the sun. There was Nefertiti, known for her beauty. There was Tutankhamun, the boy king, whose tomb was filled with gold. And there was Cleopatra, the last queen, who spoke many languages and ruled with strength. Statues of rulers stood tall, carved in stone, unmoving, eternal. Writing was sacred, hieroglyphs, pictures carved into stone, each symbol carrying meaning. Scribes worked carefully, line by line. They recorded harvests, taxes, prayers, and laws. Papyrus scrolls filled with words rolled and stored for generations. To write was to preserve memory, and in Egypt, memory was sacred. The people gathered for festivals. Music played, flutes, drums, harps. People danced. Offerings were given to the gods. Incense filled the air. Boats floated on the Nile, decorated with flowers. Torches lit the night. Songs echoed across the river. Celebrations ended, and the desert was silent once more. Egypt traded with distant lands. Caravans crossed the desert, bringing gold, ivory, spices. Ships sailed the sea, carrying grain, linen, papyrus. Merchants spoke many languages. Markets filled with color, with sound, with smell. And when trade ended, silence returned. Only the desert remained. Most people were farmers. Some made pottery, some made jewelry, some were scribes. Scribes dipped reed pens in ink and wrote carefully on papyrus. Soldiers guarded the land and marched along the borders. Meals were simple: bread, beer, onions, dates, fish. Families gathered together, told stories, and rested under the evening sky. The desert cooled, the stars shone bright, and the night was calm.